So at the end of the book, you mentioned some of the things you learned from your mother after her death. Did you learn anything about either of your parents after their deaths that helped explain their behavior to you?
Yeah, it all had to be posthumous because there was nothing really much to go on.
Mm-hmm.
Because really they never spoke about anything difficult. But I was able to piece together some things after my mother's death that helped to explain her better. This is not in the book, so I'm telling you something you won't read if you read the book, but it's an interesting piece of background knowledge. It's one of the things that made me at one point think that the book ought to be about my mother rather than me, because she really had a very difficult life, but I didn't know enough to make, I mean, it would have been fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to make something that, would tell the truth. And, but here's what I know. There was a woman who used to come and visit us every fall, like clockwork. She would show up for one day, spend the night, and leave. We called her Aunt Peg. She was the woman who had introduced my parents when my dad was in medical school. She was in medical school. They were both becoming doctors. And my mother was the secretary to the president. And Margaret and my mother, Elizabeth, were best friends. And Margaret knew that Elizabeth wanted to marry a doctor, so she introduced my dad to her, and they eventually married. And like I said, she used to come to the house every fall, and I would always say, Aunt Peg, why do you come and visit us? And she would say, in her New England accent, she would say, well, I've come to check up on your mother. And I thought, well, she's a doctor, so a checkup, that's, important. Peg was, by the way, a very tall, very mannish woman, faint mustache, very broad shoulders, wore the kind of black watch plaid suits and a little Tyrolean hat with a feather straight out of the 40s, and rimless glasses. You all know the type. And, but loving, wonderful heart, wonderful generosity that just exuded from every pore. And anyway, she stopped coming after a while, after about 10 years, and yet I kept in touch with her all my life, kind of lose touch. And later on, after my mother died, she insisted that I stop calling her Aunt Peg, wanted me to call her Margaret. And then the year that she was dying of leukemia, she invited Sarah and me to come out to her place in Carmel for Thanksgiving. She paid our way. She wanted to meet Sarah, kind of vet my my wife, and we all had dinner, and then Margaret said, David, I did want to meet Sarah, and I did want to see you again, but I also brought you out here for one specific purpose. I wanted to tell you something that I think you don't know. I said, what? She said, I introduced your parents, and I was best man at their wedding. I said, I know. And she said, well, what you don't know is that a year after she married your father, your mother left him and came to live with me. And we were together for 2 wonderful years. And then, for some reason, she went back to him. I think she was always afraid of being poor. And so my mother left the person that she should have married, the person who truly loved her, and went back to my father and was miserable ever after. Mm-hmm. So I remember, this is the way the book once ended at one point, with her telling me this, and I said to her, you're the one who loved her, you're the one who should have married her. And Margaret said, yes, that's probably true, but then where would you have come from, David? It was another era, folks.
Exactly. So are there lingering physical effects from what you went through as a child?
I'm sorry?
Are there any lingering physical effects?
Physical effects.
From what you went through?
No, aside from having one vocal cord and losing my voice occasionally at critical moments, I don't have any, the cancer didn't come back. But the effects, the mental effects certainly linger on. I think I have lived an entire life with the knowledge, the sure knowledge that most people don't have, that life can be over just like that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the benefit of that is it's given me a sense of urgency.
Mm-hmm.
It's given me sort of an automatic feeling for discipline and focus and to get things done,
Mm-hmm.
because it could all be over
Exactly.
so fast, so quickly.
Mm-hmm.
You know. So good side, bad side.
Exactly. How important of a role did the rabbit, the analyst, play in, in your recovery and in the telling of the story and going back?
For those of you who haven't read the book, the rabbit, that's how I portrayed my analyst. He was the most important figure in my young life. Well, how can I say it? Somebody said that the perfect psychoanalyst is like the perfect parent. And that psychoanalysis at its best is a process of reliving your life with a perfect parent.
Mm-hmm.
And he was, to me, a perfect parent. He was patient, he was always loving, he was always supportive, he was strict with me when I needed guidance. He certainly overstepped the bounds of the AMA a couple of times. He took me out, I remember one day he took me out to a store and showed me how to buy a shirt, because in some ways I was one of those kids who didn't even know how to tie his own shoes. And I'd certainly never had an interaction with a clerk in a store. Mm-hmm. And yet he knew that I was going to have to separate from my parents and move out quickly and get away from my mother, who was turning into quite a crazy lady. And so he would do things like that for me. And he would let me call him up at 2 in the morning and in hysterics. And sometimes he'd let me sleep on his couch. And he introduced me to his children, and I had breakfast with them. And he was a kind of a maverick analyst. He would tell me, he'd say, David, if the American Medical Association knew some of the things I've done with you, I'd lose my license. Mm-hmm. And but he was well known and respected in his field, enough so that one year he was asked to give the big lecture to the Child Analytic Association of America, and he gave them a message that was really dynamite. He said, it sort of spelled the end of psychoanalysis in America, actually, if taken to its full extent. He said, to effect a cure, and analysts don't really talk about cures. Mm-hmm. They talk, it's more like, the truth is you're in remission from your depressions. But he said to get anywhere near a real cure, you have to love your patient. And as he described it, nobody spoke to him afterwards, except one person, Eric Erickson, who said, very interesting. 2 years later, Anna Freud, the great, got up and gave exactly the same message. She said, you really cannot help anybody, truly help them, unless you care for them and love them. And how can every doctor do that, And now, we've seen analysis, it's practically flown out the window, it's expensive, it takes forever. And analysts, how can, you have 20 patients and really love all of them, unless you're Jesus. So it really was sort of a death knell that he was giving them. But at the end of my 12 years with him, he said, David, you've come as close to a cure as any patient I've ever had. And I've stayed in touch with him all my life, and I know that he really did love me. And I even got him to tell me why one day. And he said, can't you guess? And I said, what? He said, you were me. You and I had the same childhood. Your mother was my mother. So, interesting, eh?
Yeah. I expect that's going to be something you're going to hear a lot in the next couple of years, people reading this book.